my audience. Hello, my name is Chris Reich, and today I'm going to do my speech on the 3 phases of an organ transplant, specifically the liver from the patient's perspective. A little bit of background information. 2005, my daughter was diagnosed with having to have a liver transplant due to various and numerous medical conditions. 2006, she was given the transplant. It was kind of a stressful period of time, given she was only 4 or 5 and not knowing everything, and it's pretty much a major surgery. I had no idea what was all involved with the entire surgery, but needless to say, within that year and a half, it was essentially an eye-opening experience. So a little background information, like I said. Essentially, there are 3 phases of the entire process. You have pre-op, transplant, and post-op. And I will go into that a little bit more details here on. 2005, like I said, in 2005, we were told that my daughter needed to have a transplant, thus our venture began. So again, these are just kind of the different phases. Pre-op. This is a big part of the whole process. This is the evaluation process. According to Hopkins Medicine, the transplant team will consider all information from interviews, medical history, physical exam, diagnostic tests to determine eligibility for your transplant, essentially determining your blood type, how severe the need is for your transplant, and so forth. After that, you meet with the surgeons and what they call the transplant nurse coordinator. They go over everything from beginning to end, and your nurse coordinator is vital in the entire process. Finally, you're put on the waiting list. Essentially what that means is you sit and wait for the transplant to come in. You're given a pager, and you carry that pager with you through the entire process. Once the pager goes off, then it's your cue to head down. It is time for the surgery. So after you get that the page, you go to the hospital, and that is where you have one final meeting with the transplant surgeon and the nurse coordinator and the entire team that's going to do the operation. After all the prep work is done, you put the gown and so forth, the actual procedure begins. According to University Hospital, they kind of laid it out in really non-technical terms. The transplant is extremely complex and takes anywhere from 6 to 12 hours depending on the patient condition and if everything goes as planned. The diseased liver is removed, and the major blood vessels that feed and drain the liver are left behind for the new liver. Once the donor liver is attached, all the blood vessels and the bile duct are connected together. Now that your transplant is done, the most important, crucial part of the process begins, which is the recovery time. After surgery, the transplant team will follow the patient closely during the entire recovery. Typically, on average, the recovery is 7 to 10 days, if no complications. If there's complications, it could be further, depending on the need of the patient. There's constant follow-up within the first 6 weeks to 2 months. You're doing weekly blood draws to determine if your body's rejecting it or if it's doing good, and you're on probably about a good 6 to 8 different medications depending on the need. Eventually, those blood draws will taper off depending on how everything's going. If it's not, it's a back and forth game. Unfortunately, you will forever be on anti-rejection medicine because your body considers it a foreign object, so it's always going to try to reject it. So in closing, essentially there are 3 different phases to a transplant from a patient's perspective. You got the post-op, the actual procedure, excuse me, the pre-op, the actual procedure, and the post-op. One little interesting fact I'll leave you with today. According to the Mayo Clinic, 72% of people will live for 5 years after a successful transplant. Doesn't seem like a high number, but given how far medical advances every year, I consider it a pretty good start. Thank you. My audience pans.